Artificial intelligence and art. Hello, I'm Richard Howard. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levy, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And we're delighted to have with us today Emily Gould, who is the Assistant Director of the Institute of Art and Law. And Emily's done an awful lot of work on the technology aspects of art. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
Can we start with just asking how you've got interested in this intersection between art and technology?
My interest really comes more from the museum side. I'm not as much into the sort of technical aspects of these various tools. I don't write computer code. I'm not a techie in that sense at all. But I grew really interested in how museums and galleries and artists take on board new developments and incorporate them into their practices, and also how the law then responds to all of that. Because I think there's possibly an expectation that artists might want to experiment with new technologies and try out these new techniques and push the boundaries a bit, but maybe a little bit less so with our public cultural institutions, which I think are often characterised a little bit as possibly a bit conservative with a small c. But in fact, though, through the course of my research in recent years, I've been really impressed by just how ready many museums have been to dip their toes into these new technological waters and to try something new. And of course, museums and galleries are not passive repositories of historical records, but active participants in contemporary society. And so I think a lot of them have used these new technologies to engage with new audiences. And so I think engaging in these new technological and societal developments where appropriate and relevant for these institutions is really sort of fulfilling for them and for their audiences. And in particular, I got interested, I guess, from a slightly more academic perspective, when those little things called NFTs exploded onto the art market back in 2021. There was a sale by Christie's of a digital work through an NFT for $69 million. And the art world got very excited about it all. And there was a lot of commentary on this particular sale. And I think lots of people thought, well, maybe this is a bit of a flash in the pan with this new technology, but the discussions were still going on several weeks later. So I thought I ought to kind of try and understand a bit of this technology. So I wrote a few blogs and articles, and so got interested there. And then those NFTs, those non-fungible tokens, rather spectacularly crashed from a commercial perspective anyway in 2022. And the little acronym NFT was quite quickly replaced by the even shorter one, AI. And that became the new buzzword in the art world. So
you wrote a brilliant article on NFTs for art, antiquity and law. I'm going to try and avoid using too many acronyms in all this. And yes, it got big and collapsed. And I know particularly from the work with some of your students have been doing that they're coming back in some further form. And I think we'll sort of return to and deal properly with the NFT topic in another podcast in due course. There's an awful lot potentially to cover on those. But AI, artificial intelligence, from my perspective, certainly, of not being so integrated in that sort of technology, can you just sort of take us through, first of all, with reference to the cultural sector, what artificial intelligence is?
Yeah, you need to help us understand, Emily.
Yeah, huge topic, of course. But probably the best definition of AI we have at the moment, certainly from a legal perspective, I guess, comes from a very recent, hot off the press EU AI Act, which is quite a groundbreaking piece of legislation, sort of world leading at the moment. There's nothing really elsewhere to compare with it. It came into force just a few months ago, 1st of August 2024, although it won't be fully implemented for a couple of years. But it talks about an AI system as being something which is machine-based, computer-based, essentially, and can operate with a degree of autonomy and adaptability and can generate outputs based on inputs it receives. So I think in simple layman's terms, we often think about AI, artificial intelligence, or the systems that encompass that technology as systems which can perform tasks which we would ordinarily consider would require human intelligence. So maybe it will help to trace just very briefly, the sort of development of artificial technology over the last 70 or so years, really, because the technology in some form or other has been around since the 1950s, really, with the seminal work of Alan Turing, considered really to be the father of theoretical computer science. And in those early stages in the 1950s, that was what was happening, the kind of initial development of computerized technology, being able to use machines to crunch the numbers, to do analysis and make calculations. And there are thought to be really sort of three phases of development. So that was the first one. Then in the 1980s, there was quite a shift forward because those couple of decades, 80s and 90s, saw the development of something called machine learning, whereby models are trained by being fed lots of data so that they can start to make decisions and predictions. And then in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, we've seen the emergence of something called deep learning, which is a much more complex form of machine learning, which uses these things called neural networks. As I mentioned up front, I'm not a techie person, so I'm going to explain this as far as I understand it on a pretty high level. And these are sort of huge networks which can effectively mimic the operations of the human brain. And they're often built around these things called large language models. So a model is built, a program is written, which is then fed huge quantities of data. So if we're talking about, we often hear this phrase generative AI. So these tools which can generate some kind of content. So a Gen AI tool which is going to spit out images will be fed lots and lots of images. So it can learn to identify patterns. So it can identify a dog as a dog because it sees lots and lots of images of dogs in different guises. And then it can sort of look at those, compare those, and then create a dog when someone prompts it with the word dog. So essentially, that's how these tools have developed. And I think it's really interesting to think about sort of the changes between the initial technology and what we're looking at now, because I think in the initial phases, programmers were telling the machines what to do, and they might not know what answers those machines would give, but they would understand how they got there. Whereas now the technology has become so sophisticated that not only do we not know what the answers will be, we don't always necessarily know how the machine, how the computer program has reached that decision, because the programs are effectively developing their own code through these very complex deep learning methods.
In the relatively recent past, and of course it's still used, you use computers for modelling, so entirely nothing to do with art at all, but modelling of the performance of road junctions and traffic network, and the programs called Arcady and Piccadilly and Saturn and so on. And as I always follow those, the operator of the system would be putting in the assumptions about and the data and what's known of the traffic, and the computer would crunch it and come up with some figures which hopefully reflect what the effect of the development would be on the road network and so on. But with generative AI, the system is learning, and you say you could produce an image of a dog because it's learned what a dog looks like. So first question for the creative sector and the art sector in particular is, what about the data which the system is using to learn? How does it get it, and what are the consequences for artists and other generators of that data?
That's a really good question, Richard, which is being debated within the creative industries all over the world, really, at the moment. And so these Gen AI tools which produce images are taught by being fed lots of underlying images, and they're often scraped from the internet. And so if the copyright holders in those underlying images have not consented to the use of those images as training data, prima facie, we have a copyright infringement. It looks very much like their rights are being infringed. So lots of creators are very worried about that situation at the moment. And the AI developers are seeking, obviously, justifications for the way in which they operate. And they are looking at what are called these copyright exceptions to see whether they can fit their activities within any of those exceptions. So there are lots of different forms of copyright exceptions, and in different jurisdictions, different potential exceptions might be relevant. So at the moment, certainly within the EU and the UK, the exception which is probably most discussed is one which is often yet another acronym for us, called the TDM exception. So it's called text and data mining, which essentially allows you to use existing copyright works in order to, so you can process them, reproduce them for sort of scientific research effectively. And there are variations of this kind of exception in different countries. Sometimes they're for non-commercial purposes only. Sometimes you are allowed to use them for commercial purposes. And in those cases, generally, you would need to give an opt-out to the rights holder. So an AI developer, for example, might need to have a mechanism for allowing artists who don't want their works to be used in this way to opt out of that. And there are various discussions about how that opt-out might be implemented. Does it have to be a form of opt-out which can be understood by a computer, so machine readable? Or is it enough for you to have, if you're an artist, to have terms and conditions on your website in natural language, which say you cannot use my work in this way? So all these debates are going on at the moment. And there is litigation, certainly in the US and the UK and in various other countries, debating these issues to see whether those developing these algorithms can in fact use the data in that way. But of course, the creative industries have been quite worried about this, and there's been lots of sort of lobbying and attempts to try to protect creatives so that they are properly remunerated for the work that they do. And whether this whole thing will end up in some kind of a sort of a collective licensing system which will afford remuneration to those creatives is sort of yet to be seen.
And how would you ever know as a creative? How do you know whether you're, just say you try and opt out, how do you know if you're opting out in all the right places and you haven't been caught out by something you didn't know you had to do? And how can you ever stop people from just carrying on regardless?
Yeah, well, these are the difficult questions. And I mean, maybe the law can help in time, but at the moment, I think creatives are looking to technology to try to protect their rights. So there are various programs being developed, often by artists themselves, artists working in the digital space, whereby, and they act in different ways. So some of them try to block the scrapers.
Confuse them.
Yeah, to confuse them, exactly. And others try to confuse them by poisoning the data effectively, such that if a tool attempts to use them to train itself, then they will effectively just undermine that tool. So I, as a user, try to prompt the tool to give me a dog, and it will give me a cat instead because the underlying data has been poisoned. That's on a very basic level how I understand these tools to work. So yeah, so artists are looking to technology to try to protect themselves at the moment.
It kind of seems a little bit like an adversarial atmosphere. People trying to do things that they aren't supposed to or wanted to do, and then others trying to poison the data. It feels like we're all pitted against each other rather than all trying to move in the same direction. Maybe that's just the nature of it.
Yeah, I think at the moment there is something of a bit of a sort of standoff, almost a bit of a disconnect between those two sides, between the developers and the creatives. And I think what governments are trying to do, certainly in the UK at the moment, is to try to create a sort of a path between that, a middle ground. And certainly the UK government has been through something of a journey in this particular area. So the previous government had, a fair while back now, proposed an extension. So the exception that I was talking about that allows you to use copyright works for that data mining, that text and data mining activity in the UK was for non-commercial purposes. So we had that exception under our Copyright Act. That was already in legislation. And the government proposed extending that from non-commercial purposes to all purposes to create, I mean, it was a very sort of pro-business, pro-innovation stance. So that was the proposal. And the creative industries were somewhat perturbed by that. And there was a bit of an outcry. So there was a bit of a U-turn then by the government. And then there were negotiations. There was a working group set up to try and look at this, to try and find a way through. And that actually broke down. I think it was February this year. So no compromise could be found. And then, of course, we had a change of government in the UK. And just very recently, I think it was just the 6th of November, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an announcement from DCIT, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, that there's going to be a new central body, an AI assurance platform, and a new sort of tool to try and help businesses through how to implement AI safely into their organisations. And that there was also a comment on the copyright issues. And so the government confirmed its belief in both human-centred creativity on the one hand and the potential of AI to unlock new creative frontiers. So again, trying to sort of find a middle path between those two sort of opposing sides.
I mean, some sense of getting a licensing system seems attractive. I mean, as a member, as probably all of us are in one way or another, there's sort of the Authors Licensing and Collection Society, where you get a little sort of payment for any time anybody copies parts of one of your books. That sort of seems to be a route through to allow AI to operate, but actually to remunerate the people who are providing the information that enables AI to develop. Can us look at outputs? So you have an AI system which has taken in a lot of data and it's scanned huge numbers of artworks and different styles and what have you. What does it learn from that? To what extent is that capable of engaging the creative process itself in terms of producing output, or to what extent is it derivative?
That's an interesting question. And that is kind of the second half of the debate around all of these copyright issues. What is the status of the output from an algorithm? Can that be a creative work in itself? When I prompt my algorithm to produce my dog wearing a circus hat, whatever it might be, is there copyright in that output? That's a big question. And if so, who might own that? So again, there are a lot of debates around this and differing opinions really from different jurisdictions. There's not a lot of case law on this yet, but certainly the cases are starting to come through and the rulings are very interesting. So in short, there are some countries which afford copyright to something called computer generated works. And the UK is one of those countries. There aren't so many of them actually, but there are lots of complications really around that. The whole area of copyright in these computer generated works has been in debate even before the onset of AI, and there's a kind of certain lack of clarity around that. But in other jurisdictions, it is very clear that you need to be able to point to a human author for copyright to arise. And this has been the case in the US, and it's been addressed several times by US courts. And there's a very interesting case, actually. Some listeners might have heard of this one. So there's a scientist and an inventor called Dr. Stephen Thaler. And he became quite famous for trying to register patents initially all over the world in the name of a machine. So he created this machine called Darbus. And then the machine itself invented things. And he tried to register patents on these inventions in the name of the machine, mostly unsuccessfully in almost all jurisdictions. And he then turned his mind to copyright. And so he created an image using an AI tool, and he tried to register the copyright with the Copyright Office in the US, which you can still do. Copyright is not registrable in the UK, but it is in the US. And the response was pretty definitive. And the US Copyright Office said that it refused the application, said that it couldn't register a work which lacks human authorship. And it cited another really interesting case, again, not to do with AI specifically, but a case that made it very clear that you need a human author for copyright. And it was one involving a monkey, the monkey selfie.
Oh, yes.
Again, people, you might remember that one. So where a monkey managed to get hold of the photographic equipment of a wildlife photographer, took a photo of herself, this beautiful macaque monkey in Sulawesi, and then an animal charity, PETA, brought a case against the photographer to say that he wasn't able to exploit that photograph because the copyright was owned by the monkey. Actually went to court in San Francisco, and then I think everybody saw sense really, and it was settled out of court, I think, such that the photographer has to now give a donation to an animal charity every time that photo is exploited. But All that's to say, very clear in the US that you do, at the moment, that you do need a human author. But then, of course, it's not always that cut and dried, because I think when we're looking at some of these images, whether or not there will be copyright will always be a question of analysing the particular circumstances and whether there is enough creativity in the production of that image for copyright to arise, and it won't always be clear. There was a fascinating case in China, actually, in a Beijing court involving a woman who had created an AI image, and then she put it up on her social media, and she found that somebody else had taken it without her consent. So she brought a copyright infringement claim, and she won, because the court said that copyright did arise in that image, and the specific way in which it was created. And apparently the prompt, so the words that this woman put together to create this image, were very detailed. There was lots of creativity that went into them, and so there was copyright, and she, as the user, owned that copyright. Because that, again, that's another question. If there is copyright, who owns it? I mean, is it the developer who's created the tool? Is it the person who puts the prompt in? Is it the person who trains the tool? And like I say, I think it will be a sort of case-by-case analysis at the moment. There's no sort of definitive ruling on any of all of this.
I think something that scares me as a litigator about the notion that a computer system or a Macau monkey is able to be the copyright holder is that presumably that then means that they can litigate. And the notion that you have computer systems as claimants commencing litigation probably makes the overpressed legal system even more worried if they're just sort of issuing huge numbers of cases without human input. But in terms of the creativity and partly the question what's in, but also where the rights is, I was trying one of the AI sort of image generation programs and come on to the limitations of the data perhaps in a moment. But one thing I typed in was Keir Starmer at swimming pool, and it came up with a swimming pool in the front foreground, Keir Starmer wearing a suit and a sort of quite bright red Make America Great Again type tie, which party members perhaps might not appreciate. But I also typed in Boris Johnson at swimming pool, and the programme came up with an image of Boris Johnson somebody did look like Boris Johnson, standing by a swimming pool wearing Speedos. And I'm not sure any of us are going to recover from that, but would a copyright in that image exist? And would it be the person who wrote the AI program, or would I be entitled to the copyright image and all the image rights, and that'd be adorning many walls around the world and so on, simply because I typed in Boris Johnson at swimming pool? Which is probably about the limit of my creative abilities, actually.
In that instance, there may well not be enough creativity in that prompt for you to be the owner of any copyright. But there are, of course, these kinds of situations do raise numerous potential legal issues. Also, rights over personal data. There are lots of sort of personal data issues which arise, if we're using people's images. So, yeah, lots of very tricky questions there, I think.
It's easy to come up with horrifying doomsday scenarios of everything that can go wrong and how our images can be used. And I mean, they are all the time. We read stories about people's images being taken and used for nefarious purposes, which is really not a joke. But there is also a more positive aspect to all of this. So, Emily, you and I were at the same art law conference last week, at which an eminent British artist was asked a question from the audience: how worried are you about AI? And the artist responded that he was not worried about AI from the perspective of somebody whose entire work is creation. He said, until a computer can pick up a paintbrush and create new works of art as I can, why would I be worried? And I thought that was tremendously optimistic and really pretty sensible perspective.
No, I absolutely agree. And there is the view that AI is just one of a number of many tools which artists can use for really positive purposes. And there are indeed many artists experimenting with the technology and doing really incredible things. I mean, there's a digital artist called Rafik Anadol who has sold a huge monumental work to MoMA in New York, and that's been exhibited all over the world. I think it was in the Serpentine Gallery actually last year. And in fact, the Serpentine has got another exhibition on at the moment based around AI art. And that is a sound work which has used recordings of lots of different choirs to create this kind of this sound piece, which I'm yet to go and see, but I'm very excited about. So yeah, there is lots of really interesting creative work going on. And museums and galleries too, I've been sort of looking into this quite a bit, have found really interesting ways of using AI and incorporating it within their practices, both from the artistic and creative and curatorial point of view, and also in the back end of operations, very useful applications for things like predicting visitor numbers, like scheduling maintenance and conservation, like classifying and cataloguing objects. There are numerous really interesting and useful projects which are based around the use of these tools. And there are so many applications. The use of algorithms in the authentication of works of art is becoming increasingly utilized. And these tools can enable really detailed and deep comparisons of a candidate work against known existing works by an artist. And it's interesting. So there are lots of these tools around at the moment and at various stages of development. And some listeners may well have read some of these stories because sometimes they come to different conclusions, inevitably, really, because they're based on different models, different mechanisms. And there was one quite famous case that was in the press quite a bit about a work that was potentially attributable to Raphael, the Debreti Tondo. And one particular AI tool concluded that it was undoubtedly a Raphael, whilst another was pretty sure that it was not 85% likely not to be a genuine Raphael. So I think in using these tools, we need to sort of understand how they work, how they come to those conclusions, how they analyze these works, because it turns out that one of those programs was based around comparing the faces in various known Raphael works with this candidate work, whilst the other analysed the work in a much more sort of technical way, looking at the technical aspects, the brushstrokes, the composition, etc. But certainly there are lots and lots of really very interesting uses. And I find it very exciting to see the different ways in which these tools can be used in really positive ways.
I don't think any of us really believes that humans have been replaced quite yet, certainly.
No, for sure. And I mean, the thing is, the way these tools are developed depends on human intelligence and human analysis in the first place. I mean, if you look at the authentication tools, for instance, some of the data which is fed into them is based on connoisseurship. It's based on a human looking at a painting and deciding what they think of it.
Yeah, so the sort of rubbish in, rubbish out scenario potentially, but more particularly errors in what's introduced, even if you're not scraping a sort of a poisoned well which pretends that the dog is a cat and so on.
That's true, Richard. Errors and also bias. This is a subject of huge debate because tools which are trained on a particular set of data may well replicate and perpetuate and intensify biases in that underlying data. And I think that's been researched in various different areas, and certainly image generation, sort of gender and racial stereotypes have been seen to have been reproduced, which is not a good thing. So we need to be really cognizant of that, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Part of my little sort of scoot through was to type in sort of barrister at court. And not only does it inevitably come up with a white male, but what one came up with was somebody wearing what looked like an American judicial robe with a gavel. And every listener to this podcast will know that the only people in Britain who use gavels are auctioneers. Judges don't have them, and certainly barristers don't have them. We sort of tap it down, keep the witness in order, or what have you. So we've got the problem of the biases in terms of the information that comes out, but also is there ultimately going to be a question of, well, how you analyse it and make the judgment. So how the expert who is using an AI tool to help them with the attribution of the Raphael, whatever it is going to understand how the computer comes up with its conclusion, and so how reliable that is, let alone getting to the situation where perhaps there's a dispute about that, and the court has to resolve, which at the moment it can seek to do by hearing the expert evidence and the like. But if we don't know how the computer's reached its conclusion, how can somebody evaluate whether the AI system conclusions right, or how much weight to attach to that in reaching their overall judgment?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Richard. And I think something that all of the current guidance and frameworks and indeed legislation that is being introduced focuses on very heavily is this notion of transparency. We need to know how these tools are developed and how the models work in order for them to be used, not only in the courtroom, not only in a legal setting, but in many situations, we need to understand how they work in order to use them in a kind of responsible and ethical way.
So we talk about authentication. Is there a role for AI in terms of the restoration or conservation to help conservators try and understand what bits of the later alterations and so on? Is it helping in terms of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So AI tools were used in parts of the reconstruction of Notre Dame, for example. And there's a fascinating project at the Rijksmuseum. So AI tools have been used as part of a much wider project to try to reconstruct part of the very famous work, Rembrandt's Night Watch. So this project has been going on for several years. And so there was literally a strip of the painting that had been there at some point, but had been literally sliced off, shaved off. And so they've been able, with the use of AI tools, to recreate that part of the painting, which is really fascinating.
And just in terms of any sort of other risks that sort of come out of AI, we've looked at some of the issues on that, but what else do you see there might be?
So, I mean, the risks are manifold, really. So we've touched on the risk of bias and those risks of copyright infringement, so potential inadvertent infringement of somebody else's copyrights by using a tool which was trained on non-consented works. But in terms of the output, the risk of misinformation, again, we've touched on that really, that the underlying data is flawed or what comes out is very misleading. I mean, we read all the time about the problem of deep fakes, and that is a real risk, I think. For the public sector, for museums and galleries using AI tools, the lack of transparency around the fact that AI has been used to produce content could potentially, I think, make people a little bit wary of the information they read. If they're thinking, well, this has been created by a machine, not a human, is that right? Can I trust it? So that element of trust, I think, is one risk. And then more broadly, I mean, there's a lot of talk about whether AI might take all of our jobs. Even in the legal sector, there's quite a few tasks which people are saying could be conducted by AI going forwards. And I think just from a practical perspective, companies, organizations looking at adopting or buying some of these tools and incorporating them into their work, there's a sense that the technology is so quickly developing at the moment. Is it worth the time and cost investment at this stage to take on board these new tools when 6 months' time even they might be out of date? We might all be using something completely different. But I think already there are being developed some ways of addressing and mitigating some of these risks. So within museums, for example, I know quite a few museums are looking at putting in place policies, really robust policies, governing and regulating and sort of giving guidance on the use of AI by various different sectors of those organizations. So the Smithsonian, for example, has got a very interesting and I think useful AI value statement, which talks about only engaging in projects using tools which are respectful to the communities that particular museum represents, being proactive in trying to identify any biases, just really thinking about whether the use of AI is appropriate in the particular context, thinking about the environmental aspect, which is something we haven't touched on, but AI, like NFTs, like those non-fungible tokens that I did quite a bit of research into, a lot of these tools take huge amounts of computational power. So that's another consideration. So yeah, as I say, there are lots and lots of risks, but also lots of thought being put into how they might be mitigated and how we might be able to use AI for the good in legal and ethical and positive ways.
Emily, thank you so much. It is a fascinating, you say, it's an incredibly quickly developing topic. We mentioned one article in Art, Antiquity and Law already. Is a very good article in the latest edition, the October edition, by Pierre Valentin, Stephanie Drury and Eloise Calder on AI, art and copyright. It's only part one. I think part two is going to follow in due course. There's a lot to pick up on that, and I'm sure we will be coming back to those topics in due course. But Emily, thank you so much for joining us and certainly helping me understand the topic.
Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you, Richard. I've really enjoyed it. And as you say, lots more to talk about.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.